What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video here. In this video, what I want to do is I want to dive a little bit more into my color grading process in Davinci Resolve. So I am by no means an expert when it comes to color grading. I'm not a colorist. I've basically just learned from a lot of trial and error and also watching a lot of videos on YouTube. And so I'm going to break down my process of color grading and the kind of template that I have created that has worked for me, and I'm able to adjust as needed. So this process will allow you to take a clip that's in S-Log footage like this and convert it to something that looks like this. So let's hop into Davinci Resolve. And I should preface that I am using the full version of Davinci Resolve, so I'm not sure if some of these features are available on the free version. So just keep that in mind when we go into it. I will show you guys the node tree structure that I used for my color grade for this clip. And I'll go over all of the adjustments that I did within each individual node. I'm not going to start from scratch as some people do in their tutorials. It's just going to take a little too much time. So I will unveil each node one at a time just to show you the adjustments that were made in each node and give you a sense of how I landed on the final color grade that I did. So hopping into Davinci Resolve, let's go into the color tab here. And so as you can see here, we have the node tree laid out. It looks pretty complicated, but I tried to make it make sense as much as possible. Obviously, like I said, I'm not an expert, so this could probably be condensed down even further. It's just, this is what has become intuitive to me. And so I continue to use this node structure for a lot of my color grades and then just kind of adjust it where necessary. And so I will just take a second to mention that it is so key to be organized when it comes to color grading with nodes. The last thing you want is to have a huge node tree that doesn't have labels for each individual node, so you really just end up playing a guessing game as to what adjustment is on each node. If you take the time to actually label each node with what adjustments correspond to it, it'll make your life a lot easier. It'll save you a headache, and frankly, in this situation, organization is kind of sexy. Like, I mean, look how good that node tree looks. It's kind of attractive. That's an attractive node tree. So anyways, let's hop into this node tree. So what I want to do is I want to actually start with our color space transform. So this one is very crucial. So as you can see with the image, I shot it in an S-Log 3, so it's a very flat image. So what you have to first do is you have to convert it to Rec 709, which is a more manageable image to then color grade afterwards. So to do this, to do the color space transform, what I want to do is I want to go up to the effects panel, and I will go to the effects library, and you simply search up color space transform. It's actually just right down here. And so then just drag and drop it right onto just right into the node there. I already have it in there, so it'll come up with a menu like this. And what you want to do is I put the input color space as Davinci wide gamut. I put the input gamma as Davinci intermediate, and then the output color space as Rec 709, and then I leave the output gamma as the timeline. And so then what I'll do is I'll turn this node on and I'll show you what it does. So it basically creates a Rec 709 image that is far more usable than what it previously was in the S-Log 3. Obviously, you don't want to stop there because it's still a very flat image. So what I want to do next is I want to actually look at the parallel nodes, so the contrast and exposure nodes. And so for the contrast nodes, I just want to introduce some contrast back into the image because it's a pretty flat image still, despite being converted over into Rec 709. So what I did was I mainly used the offset wheel for this adjustment here. So I brought it down to 19.3, as you can see there. I adjusted the contrast dial here slightly, but I mainly stuck to the offset. So as you can see, it just adds a little bit more contrast back in. So then moving on to the exposure node, what I did with this one is I went to the HDR wheels and I just adjusted the global exposure here. Just brought it down to -0.31. And then what I also did was I went to the luminance curves and I just, as you can see, brought that down at the top there just to make the highlights pop a little bit. And I brought the shadows down a little bit just to make it a little darker in the shadows. But it's just very subtle, very subtle changes. So let's go over to the white balance node here. And so for this one, it was in the primary color wheels again. So with this one, what I wanted to do is I wanted to reduce a little bit of the green and blue in the lift, introduce a tiny bit of red here in the gamma, and then I also just decreased the offset again. I brought that down to 22.6, and I significantly decreased the saturation to 38.4. And I also decreased the contrast here to 0.742. Like I said, my methods aren't necessarily the way to do it. It's just what I did to actually achieve this look. So don't necessarily do exactly what I do. Take it with a grain of salt and play around, find what works better for you. There's probably a much better organizational structure that works for you, and that's amazing. So then, yeah, going into the log wheels here, just adjusted the highlights. So brought the reds down, brought the greens and blues up, as you can see there. That's all for the white balance. So as you can see, it basically just desaturates the image a little bit. So next I want to go into the node that contains my look, or the LUT basically that I created. And so let's hop in here. So it goes under the primary wheels as well. So for this, let's start off in the primary color wheels. And what I did was I wanted to introduce quite a bit of cyan into the image. So I bumped up the blue values and the green values, and then I reduced the red values. In the gamma, what I did was I actually reduced some of the greens and blue values, as you can see here, and added in a little bit of extra red here. And then I also pulled down the offset to 17.95 just to make it a little bit darker, more contrasty again. I added in some contrast on the contrast wheel up here, and then I reduced the saturation to 72.2. So then going over to the log wheels, what I did was I basically tried to balance out the shadows a little bit more. So I reduced some of the blues, some of the greens, and increased the reds. And then with the midtones, I just added in some blues, some greens, and reduced some reds. So as you can see, it created a pretty significant change there. But we're not done there. So what I wanted to do then is I wanted to do a bunch of specific color adjustments. So that's why you have the color adjustment node. So for this one, what I did was I used the curves. And as you can see here with the custom curves, I adjusted just the red ever so slightly there. And then going into the hue versus hue, this is where things got a little crazy, and I adjusted quite a few different values, different colors, to create a specific look that I'm wanting to achieve. Overall, I wanted to make it a very moody looking shot, where a lot of the greens were desaturated, the blues were more of a ashy, grayy blue type look. I also adjusted the saturation levels, so I significantly reduced the saturation of greens. I tend to not really like very vibrant greens in my shots, and I also reduced saturation levels of some of the blues too, and then also reduced the luminance values for the greens. And so overall that created a look like that. So it made it a lot more moody and more along the lines of what I was looking to achieve in the final image. So you could technically stay like that, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to add an additional look to the image. So I wanted to have more of a film look, and I love a lot of the film emulations that Davinci Resolve has in the full version. So I used one of those. So I just added a film look node, and so I added it under the LUT folder, and so just under the film looks, I used the Rec 709 Kodak 2383D55. So I did that, and so yeah, so I put that on there. But I find that this tends to be a bit too punchy, and so what I did is I went to the key tab here, and I just reduced the offset to negative 0.495. And I also reduced the contrast to 0.822. Just kind of play around with it. You'll get a look that you're wanting to achieve. A lot of the times these film emulation LUTs are way too strong and, like I said, too punchy, and they just really kind of destroy your image. So let's move on to the stack of parallel nodes. Okay, so what I wanted to do first is to play around with the skin tones. I always like to balance my skin tones whenever I color grade. I created 2 parallel nodes here for isolating the skin tones. And the reason for that is the first one here, this one is simply for using the qualifier and actually isolating the skin tones. So once you have these skin tones isolated, then I make sure that the alpha output is connected from the first parallel node to the second. That way any adjustment I do here on the second parallel node will impact the area selected with the qualifier on the first node. So it'll impact just the skin tones. I just find that adds an additional step of organization. And yeah, so basically what I did for the skin tones is I boosted the temperature just up to 160, as you can see here. It was just a little too blue. I then went in and increased the overall exposure to 0.08. And then I played around with the hue versus hue. So I changed the overall hue of the skin to make it a little bit more orange. I found it was a bit too pink. And so I changed it to be a bit more orange, and then I decreased the saturation of it as well. Then I used the color warper slightly just to make some fine-tune adjustments there. I know I could have done it all on the curves, but I chose to use the color warper as well. That was all for the skin tones. As you can see, before, after. Then the next thing I really wanted to isolate were the greens of the background, so the trees on the hills back here. And so I really just wanted to reduce some of the saturation even more, and I also wanted to darken them. I wanted to pull the attention more to the subject swimming in the water rather than the hills in the background. There you go. So just wanted to make it pop a little bit more, so I dropped the offset to 20.7, and then I also adjusted some of the hue values just to change the overall hue of some of the brighter, more green areas of the hills. And I also adjusted some of the orangey yellow areas as well, and then significantly reduced the saturation for all of this. So as you can see, just drop it way down, and as you can see in the image, there's barely any color in the trees themselves. And so then I also reduced the luminance so it's not as bright there. The final parallel node here is a gradient that I added at the bottom. So this was simply just added to darken the bottom of the frame and pull more focus towards the swimmer. And so to do that, it just went here and then selected the gradient, and then I just dragged it to make it longer and more gradual, and then basically just drag down the offset values. It's super simple, but just adds additional element to your shot, and I think just kind of makes it a little bit more refined looking and professional. Again, you could easily just leave your shot like that and it would be totally acceptable. The client would be happy with it probably, but I like to add a few additional elements just to make the shot pop a little bit more. So first off, I just want to make the highlights pop and the overall frame and the overall image pop slightly. So for this, what I did was I did the luminance curves, and I just basically brought the shadows ever so slightly up and the midtones ever so slightly up. And as you can see, just brightens the overall image. Next thing I did was I wanted to add a little film grain into that, just to create some texture in the image. It's very subtle, and what I did was just went to effects and library and then just searched up film grain and just dragged it and dropped that into the node. And then within the settings, I just did a 16mm grain preset, did an overlay composite, and yeah, 0.422 for opacity, and then adjusted some of these, but a lot of them were kept as is. And it created an overall nice texture, I think, that added to the aesthetic. So as you can see, if I turn it on, turn it off, it's very subtle, like you can barely notice it. Next, I wanted to add a little pop of contrast to the highlights. And so for this, I used the contrast pop effect and basically just increased the low threshold so that it wouldn't focus at all on the shadows, and increased the high threshold to 1 as well so that it just captured the highlights. And so turning it on and off, turning it on and off, you can see a subtle change. The whites become a little whiter, and I find the overall like image tends to become a little bit more cinematic. So for the last node, I just added the glow effect. So just go into the effects library, drag and drop the glow effect to your node, and then you can see I brought down the shine threshold to 0. I brought down the spread to 0. And then the only other things that I adjusted was I turned the composite type to soft light, and then the global blend I brought to 0.331. And so as you can see, it just adds that element of brightness, makes everything a little bit more punchy, a little bit more aesthetic. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Let me know your thoughts on this. Obviously, there's certain things that are a bit nonsensical and could probably be refined even further. But I appreciate you watching along. Hopefully you learned something from this. Let me know if you have any questions, just drop them down in the comments. And thank you all for your support. It means the world to me. It's amazing to see this channel grow very slowly and have people interact more with the videos. It's very inspiring to myself. I'm learning along the way. Hope you guys are learning something, but I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.